The one thing that truly separates the greatest minds in history from ordinary people is not intelligence, not education, not background, not money, and not luck, but something far more uncomfortable and far more accessible, something you can choose at this very moment without permission or resources, something most people actively run from every single day without even realizing it, and that thing is solitude. Because look around you right now and notice how rare silence has become in the modern world. How every empty second is instantly filled with scrolling, notifications, music, podcasts, background noise, conversations, and distractions, as if being alone with your thoughts has become something dangerous to avoid. And the uncomfortable truth is that most people are not addicted to their phones. They are addicted to avoiding themselves. Because solitude forces you to face your own mind without filters, without entertainment, without escape, and that is precisely why it is so powerful. And this is not a new idea invented by modern psychology, but something deeply understood by one of the most misunderstood philosophers in history. Arthur Schopenhauer, a 19th-century German thinker who came to a conclusion so sharp and uncomfortable that most people today would instantly reject it, which is that solitude is not optional for greatness, it is mandatory. Because Schopenhauer observed something profound about human nature, something that remains just as true today as it was 200 years ago, which is that most people live their entire lives performing, adjusting, and shrinking themselves in response to others, never discovering the full depth of their own minds. And before Schopenhauer became the philosopher we study today, he was not born into hardship or isolation, but into wealth, privilege, and opportunity. Raised by a father who wanted him to become a successful merchant, travel widely, meet influential people, and build a social network. The same advice parents still give today. So, Schopenhauer tried to live this way, attending social gatherings, engaging in polite conversation, attempting to fit into the expectations of society. But instead of fulfillment, he experienced deep dissatisfaction. Because the more he surrounded himself with people, the further he felt from himself, until he made a radical choice that would change the course of his life, which was to embrace deliberate solitude. Not loneliness, not withdrawal from life, but intentional separation from noise, from social pressure, and from constant interaction. And once he made this choice, something extraordinary happened inside his mind. Because when you remove the need to impress, to agree, to compete, and to conform, the mind shifts into a different mode of operation entirely, one where ideas deepen instead of scatter, one where thoughts develop fully instead of being interrupted. And Schopenhauer captured this transformation in one of his most striking statements when he wrote that, in solitude, the small-minded person feels all his smallness, but the great spirit feels all his greatness, meaning that solitude acts like a mirror that reflects who you truly are beneath the social mask. And this is why solitude terrifies so many people, because it forces honesty. And most people spend their lives running from that honesty by drowning themselves in distraction, social approval, and constant stimulation. And what Schopenhauer realized long before neuroscience confirmed it is that the mind requires silence to operate at its highest level, because creativity, insight, and original thought do not emerge from noise, but from stillness. And this insight becomes even clearer when you understand the porcupine dilemma that Schopenhauer famously described, which illustrates how human beings crave closeness, yet harm each other when they get too close. Because in seeking warmth from others, we often injure each other through judgment, expectation, and compromise, forcing people to suppress their true beliefs just to maintain connection. And Schopenhauer chose to step away from this endless cycle, choosing self-understanding over social approval. And as a result, his ideas gained a depth and originality that echoed far beyond his own lifetime, influencing thinkers like Nietzsche, Freud, and modern psychology itself. And today, neuroscience provides scientific support for what Schopenhauer lived intuitively, because researchers have identified the brain's default mode network, the system responsible for deep self-reflection, creative insight, and meaning-making, which only activates when the mind is not focused outward on tasks or social interaction, meaning that constant distraction literally shuts down the parts of the brain responsible for originality, insight, and wisdom. And this explains why modern studies repeatedly show that people cannot tolerate being alone with their thoughts for even a few minutes without reaching for stimulation, while great thinkers throughout history deliberately structured their lives to include long periods of uninterrupted solitude. And this is not because they hated people, but because they valued truth more than approval, originality more than popularity, and authenticity more than comfort. And Schopenhauer understood that solitude teaches something no crowd ever can, which is trust in your own judgment. Because when you remove external validation, your ideas must stand on their own. And that process is uncomfortable at first, because insecurity has nowhere to hide. But over time, it builds an inner confidence that no praise or criticism can shake. And modern research confirms this as well, showing that individuals who work in solitude not only produce more original ideas, but feel more confident and satisfied with their work, because they develop a direct relationship with their own mind instead of relying on feedback loops from others. And this is how genius is cultivated, not through endless collaboration, but through deep individual thinking, followed by selective connection. And Schopenhauer's life stands as proof that originality requires separation, because if you think exactly like everyone else, you will only reproduce what already exists. And greatness is never born from repetition, but from divergence. And divergence requires the courage to stand alone long enough to hear your own thoughts fully form. And this is where most people fail. Not because they lack ability, but because they lack the patience and courage to endure silence, to sit with uncertainty, and to face their unfiltered mind without escape.
What Schopenhauer uncovered next goes even deeper, because solitude is not just about thinking better or becoming more creative. It is about discovering who you actually are beneath the layers of performance imposed by society. Because he realized that every person lives with two identities, a social self and an authentic self. The social self is adaptive, polite, agreeable, shaped by expectations and reward systems, constantly adjusting to avoid rejection and gain approval. While the authentic self is raw, independent, opinionated, and often unpopular. And for most people, the authentic self never fully emerges because it has no space to breathe, no silence in which to speak. And Schopenhauer observed that society subtly trains individuals to sacrifice authenticity for acceptance, teaching people what to say, what to want, and even what to dream. And over time, this results in a life that feels crowded yet empty, full of interaction but lacking meaning. And when Schopenhauer withdrew into solitude, he was not escaping responsibility, but reclaiming authorship over his own mind. And this allowed him to develop inner independence, the ability to think, decide, and judge without needing confirmation from others. And inner independence is the foundation of true confidence because it cannot be taken away by criticism or rejection. And this is something modern people struggle with deeply because the digital world has amplified the need for validation, turning approval into a currency that dictates self-worth. And Schopenhauer understood that when your sense of value comes from others, you become fragile, easily influenced, and afraid of being different. But when your sense of value comes from within, you become stable, grounded, and capable of making decisions that go against the crowd. And this is why so many innovators and visionaries appear stubborn or antisocial, because they are guided internally rather than externally. And what seems like arrogance is often simply self-trust developed through long periods of solitude. And here is where the paradox emerges that Schopenhauer recognized long before social psychology did, which is that solitude actually makes you more attractive to others. Because when you are not chasing approval, you radiate authenticity, confidence, and emotional stability, qualities that are rare in a world of constant comparison and insecurity. And people are instinctively drawn to those who are comfortable being alone because they project a sense of completeness rather than neediness. And this is why leaders, thinkers, and creators often seem distant or reserved, not because they dislike people, but because they are not dependent on them. And this independence makes their presence powerful. And Schopenhauer lived this paradox fully, because despite spending much of his life alone, his ideas eventually reached millions and shaped entire fields of thought, although not immediately. Because when he first published his work, it was ignored, dismissed, and rejected by the mainstream intellectual world. And this is where most people would compromise, adjust their message, or abandon their path in pursuit of acceptance. But Schopenhauer did the opposite. He retreated further into solitude, refined his ideas, and trusted that truth did not need applause to exist. And eventually, the world caught up, recognizing the depth and relevance of his philosophy long after trends had changed, proving that solitude creates timelessness, while chasing approval creates ephemerality. And this is the choice every individual faces, whether consciously or unconsciously, whether to live for immediate validation or long-term authenticity. And solitude is the space where this choice becomes clear, because without noise, you can no longer lie to yourself about why you do what you do. And this is terrifying for some and liberating for others, because solitude exposes whether your goals are truly yours or borrowed from the expectations of others. And Schopenhauer believed that the ability to be alone was a measure of inner richness, because only someone with a deep inner life can endure their own company, while those who fear solitude are often fleeing emptiness. And this idea feels threatening in a culture that equates constant activity with value. Yet the most meaningful work in history was produced in silence, in isolation, in moments where the individual faced the full weight of their own thoughts without distraction. And this does not mean rejecting relationships, but relating to them from a position of wholeness rather than dependence. And this is the lesson modern society desperately needs to relearn, because constant connection without introspection leads to conformity, anxiety, and shallow thinking, while solitude cultivates clarity, originality, and self-mastery. And Schopenhauer understood that you cannot discover your true potential while constantly reacting to the opinions of others, because reaction keeps you small, while reflection allows you to expand. And the world will always try to pull you back into noise, into consumption, into performance, because silence threatens systems that rely on distraction and compliance. But greatness has never been compatible with constant noise. And the question is not whether solitude is uncomfortable, but whether you are willing to endure that discomfort long enough to uncover the depth of your own mind. Because your greatest ideas do not exist in the crowd. They exist in the quiet moments you keep avoiding. And your authentic self does not emerge when you are being watched. It emerges when no one is there to judge you. And this is the courage Schopenhauer demonstrated throughout his life, the courage to stand alone, to think deeply, and to trust truth over popularity. And in a world flooded with copies, trends, and surface-level thinking, solitude remains the only place where something original can be born. Because only in solitude do you meet the unedited version of yourself, and that version holds everything you are capable of becoming.
There is another layer to solitude that Schopenhauer understood with unsettling clarity, and it is the layer most people avoid confronting because it forces responsibility back into their own hands, which is that solitude removes excuses. Because when you are alone, there is no one to blame, no audience to impress, no system to hide behind, and no noise to distract you from the truth of your own choices. And Schopenhauer believed that most suffering does not come from fate or circumstance, but from living out of alignment with one's own nature. Because when people ignore their inner voice long enough, they begin to feel restless, anxious, and dissatisfied without knowing why. And they try to cure this feeling with entertainment, validation, and constant movement. But these are temporary numbing agents, not solutions. And solitude strips those numbing agents away, leaving only the raw encounter between you and yourself, which can feel uncomfortable at first because it exposes contradictions between who you are and who you pretend to be.
And Schopenhauer wrote extensively about this inner conflict, arguing that most people live under the illusion that happiness comes from external success, recognition, or pleasure, when in reality, lasting fulfillment comes from inner coherence, meaning that your actions, values, and thoughts are aligned. And solitude is the environment where that alignment can occur, because without it, your mind is constantly fragmented by external influences. And modern psychology supports this idea as well, showing that uninterrupted self-reflection is essential for emotional regulation, long-term planning, and meaningful goal formation. And yet society conditions people to fear stillness, because stillness reveals dissatisfaction that distraction conveniently hides. And Schopenhauer understood that boredom itself is a signal, not a problem, because boredom arises when the mind is no longer entertained by superficial stimulation and begins searching for something deeper. And instead of escaping boredom, he leaned into it, using it as a gateway to introspection, insight, and philosophical depth. And this is precisely why solitude becomes a filter that separates those capable of greatness from those content with comfort. Because greatness requires the willingness to face uncomfortable truths. And one of those truths is that the crowd is rarely right, because the crowd moves based on emotion, imitation, and social reinforcement rather than thoughtful analysis. And Schopenhauer was brutally honest about this, believing that mass opinion tends toward mediocrity because it is designed to preserve comfort rather than truth. And while this sounds pessimistic, it is actually liberating, because it means that you are not required to follow what everyone else believes in order to live well. But you must be willing to stand apart mentally, even if you remain socially connected. And solitude is the training ground for this mental independence, because it conditions you to rely on your own reasoning instead of borrowed opinions. And this process slowly builds what Schopenhauer viewed as intellectual dignity, the ability to think clearly without being swayed by popularity, fear, or pressure. And this dignity is rare precisely because it cannot be given, taught, or transferred. It must be earned through time spent alone with one's thoughts. And this is why solitude feels heavy at first, because it forces you to confront unresolved questions about your life, your direction, and your values. But once you move through that discomfort, solitude becomes a source of strength rather than weakness, because your sense of identity becomes internal rather than reactive. And Schopenhauer warned that without this internal foundation, people become psychologically fragile, constantly affected by criticism, comparison, and rejection, while those who cultivate inner independence develop resilience that allows them to endure setbacks without losing direction. And this resilience is not loud or dramatic, but quiet and grounded, like a mountain unaffected by weather. And this is the kind of strength that modern culture rarely celebrates because it cannot be easily displayed or monetized. Yet it is the foundation of every enduring achievement. And Schopenhauer's life illustrates this clearly because despite facing rejection, neglect, and misunderstanding, he did not abandon his philosophical path because it was not built on external reward, but internal conviction. And conviction forged in solitude is far stronger than motivation fueled by praise. And this is why solitude is not a retreat from the world, but preparation to face it honestly. Because when you know who you are and what you stand for, the world loses its power to confuse or control you. And this is the state Schopenhauer reached through years of isolation, reflection, and disciplined thought, proving that solitude does not weaken the mind, but sharpens it, does not shrink the self, but reveals it, and does not disconnect you from humanity, but allows you to engage with it without losing yourself in the process.
Ultimately, what Arthur Schopenhauer teaches is not merely a philosophy of solitude, but a warning about the cost of avoiding it, because a life spent constantly surrounded by noise, opinion, and distraction may feel full, but often lacks depth, direction, and authenticity. And in a world that rewards visibility, approval, and constant interaction, choosing solitude becomes a radical act of self-respect, because it signals that you value truth over applause and clarity over comfort. And the tragedy Schopenhauer identified is that most people never experience their own mind at full strength because they are conditioned from an early age to seek meaning outside themselves, tying their worth to achievement, recognition, and comparison. And when those external sources fluctuate, as they inevitably do, their sense of self collapses with them, leading to anxiety, resentment, and a quiet dissatisfaction they cannot explain. And solitude breaks this cycle by shifting the center of gravity inward, teaching you that fulfillment comes not from being seen, but from seeing clearly. And this clarity is what allows you to move through life with intention rather than reaction. And Schopenhauer understood that the fear of solitude is ultimately the fear of self-discovery, because solitude reveals whether you are living your own life or merely fulfilling a role assigned by others. And this realization can be unsettling, but it is also the beginning of freedom. Because once you understand your own values, capabilities, and limits, you stop chasing illusions and start building something real, something enduring. And this is why Schopenhauer believed that the ability to enjoy solitude was a sign of maturity, because only someone comfortable with themselves can remain alone without escaping into distraction. And this does not mean rejecting connection, but transforming it. Because relationships formed from wholeness rather than dependency are healthier, more honest, and more meaningful. And this principle applies not only to personal relationships, but to work, creativity, and purpose itself. Because true contribution does not come from copying what already exists, but from expressing something that only you can offer. And this expression requires solitude as its incubation space, because originality cannot survive constant interference. And this is the final paradox that Schopenhauer understood deeply, which is that solitude appears empty from the outside, but rich from within, while constant social immersion appears full, but often leaves the inner world impoverished. And the modern world will continue to pull you toward noise, urgency, and performance because that is where attention is harvested and conformity is maintained. But your greatest strength does not exist there. It exists in the quiet moments you postpone, the unanswered questions you avoid, and the uncomfortable silence you try to fill. And the choice is not between isolation and connection, but between authenticity and imitation, between depth and distraction, and between living deliberately or drifting passively. And solitude is not the enemy of success, but the foundation of it. Because every meaningful decision requires clarity, every original idea requires space, and every fulfilled life requires self-understanding. And Schopenhauer's legacy reminds us that you cannot outsource those things to society, technology, or approval. They must be cultivated internally through honest engagement with your own mind and the courage to stand alone long enough to hear what it is trying to tell you. Because within that silence lies not emptiness, but direction, not loneliness, but self-possession, and not weakness, but strength. And in a world full of copies, trends, and borrowed identities, solitude remains the one place where the original version of you can still be found, waiting patiently, quietly, for you to stop running and finally listen.
When everything is stripped away, when noise fades, when expectations dissolve, when no one is watching and nothing is required of you, what remains is the truth of who you are. And Arthur Schopenhauer understood that most people never reach this point because they are terrified of what silence might reveal. Yet silence is not empty, it is revealing, because solitude does not add anything to you, but removes what is false, peeling away borrowed beliefs, inherited ambitions, social conditioning, and unconscious imitation until only the essential self remains. And this process feels uncomfortable because it forces accountability. Because when distractions disappear, you can no longer blame the world, society, or circumstances for your dissatisfaction. And Schopenhauer believed that this discomfort is necessary because it signals growth, much like physical pain signals the strengthening of muscle. And without this confrontation, people remain mentally dependent, forever shaped by trends, opinions, and the emotional weather of the crowd. And this dependency weakens the soul because it hands over authority of one's inner life to forces that neither understand nor care about individual truth. And the modern world amplifies this danger by rewarding constant visibility, reaction, and comparison, pushing people into endless loops of performance where silence feels like failure and stillness feels like death. Yet history tells a very different story, because every enduring contribution to human thought, art, science, and philosophy emerged from periods of deep solitude, where individuals turned inward long enough to understand something the crowd could not see. And Schopenhauer lived this truth fully, accepting misunderstanding, rejection, and neglect rather than compromising his ideas, because he knew that truth ripens slowly while popularity rots quickly. And this is why his work survived while countless celebrated voices of his time faded into obscurity. Because solitude does not make you trendy, it makes you precise, and precision lasts. And this is the lesson modern people resist most, because it requires patience rather than speed, clarity rather than excitement, and inner depth rather than external appearance. Yet without these qualities, life becomes shallow regardless of success, because achievement without authenticity feels hollow, and connection without self-knowledge feels crowded but lonely. And Schopenhauer warned that when people avoid solitude long enough, they lose contact with their inner compass, drifting through life guided by convenience rather than conviction, mistaking motion for progress and approval for meaning. And the tragedy is not that such lives are unsuccessful, but that they are unlived. Because the person never truly arrives, never fully inhabits their own thoughts, desires, and potential. And solitude is the doorway back to oneself, not as an escape, but as a return. Because only when you can sit alone without stimulation do you begin to hear your own mind clearly. And that clarity is what gives rise to resilience, creativity, and inner authority, qualities that cannot be faked or outsourced. And once cultivated, they change how you move through the world, because criticism loses its power, comparison fades, and fear of being different dissolves, replaced by quiet confidence grounded in self-understanding. And this is why solitude ultimately strengthens rather than weakens relationships, because when you no longer need others to complete you, you can meet them honestly rather than strategically. And Schopenhauer believed that the ability to enjoy one's own company was the highest sign of mental richness, because it meant that the individual possessed an inner life deep enough to sustain itself. And this depth cannot be purchased, taught quickly, or gained through association. It must be earned slowly through contemplation, introspection, and the courage to face oneself without illusion. And the world will always try to pull you away from this path, because distraction is profitable and conformity is convenient. But the question remains whether you want a life shaped by noise or one shaped by intention, whether you want to be endlessly occupied or deeply fulfilled, whether you want to be remembered as someone who blended in perfectly or someone who stood alone long enough to see clearly. Because solitude does not promise comfort, applause, or immediate reward, but it offers something far more valuable, which is ownership of your own mind. And that ownership is the foundation of freedom, creativity, and meaning. And Schopenhauer's legacy is not an argument against society, but an argument for self-possession, reminding us that before you can truly contribute to the world, you must first understand yourself. And that understanding begins not in crowds, not in noise, not in endless consumption, but in stillness, in silence, and in the courage to be alone. Because only there does the original version of you emerge, unfiltered, unedited, and finally free.
In the end, Arthur Schopenhauer's message is not merely about solitude, but about truth, because solitude is the environment where truth can exist without distortion, where you are no longer shaped by applause, fear, or imitation, and where your mind finally belongs to you rather than to the expectations of the crowd. And this is why solitude feels uncomfortable at first, because it removes the familiar noise that once told you who to be and what to want, forcing you to confront your own thoughts without escape. Yet within that silence lies the rarest form of freedom, the freedom of self-possession, Because when you are no longer dependent on validation, comparison, or approval, you gain clarity, resilience, and originality. And that clarity allows you to act with intention rather than reaction, to create rather than copy, and to live rather than perform. And Schopenhauer proved through his life that greatness does not come from fitting in or being constantly seen, but from standing alone long enough to understand something deeply, trusting it fully, and expressing it honestly, even when the world is slow to listen. Because truth does not need immediate recognition to be real, and authenticity does not require permission to exist. And in a world addicted to distraction, choosing solitude is a radical act of courage, patience, and self-respect, because it means you value depth over noise and meaning over momentum. And the real question you are left with is not whether solitude is difficult, but whether avoiding it has already cost you clarity, direction, and a relationship with your own mind. Because your greatest ideas, your strongest convictions, and your truest self do not live in the crowd. They live in the quiet moments you keep postponing, waiting for you to stop running, stop performing, and finally listen. Because only in solitude does the original you emerge, and only the original is ever capable of greatness.